Just a quick sort of outline what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to outline my current research and study interests. I'm going to briefly introduce Thomas Gardner and his works on dunnage, and then just say what he tells us about Easton Bavents, and then discuss that in relation to my findings, especially around the church, the chapel and the guild. And finally, a roundup of my findings, and that should leave us time for some questions. When talking about Easton Bavents, the usual question I come across is, where? Where is it? Nobody seems to have ever heard of it. So the parish, or the strip of land which is all that's left of it now, can be found just north of Southwold on the east coast of Suffolk. If you go north, the next parishes are Cove Hythe, Benwick, and then Kessingland. And this coastal eastern strip of Suffolk is known as the Sandlings, and it runs really from sort of Harwich, Felixstowe in the south, up to Benwick and Kessingland in the north. And this coastline is made up of many small villages that are reachable only really by one roadway in and one roadway out. And there's a number of small rivers, some empty into the North Sea, and others wind to a dead end with estuaries that have silted up over the years. But if you add in the salt marshes that you get, the sandy cliffs, the dramatic scenery, and the wonderful big skies, it's really obvious why this part of Suffolk has been designated as an area of outstanding natural beauty. I'm not going to dwell too much on the geography or the geology of the area for this talk, although it is fascinating. But the thing that has really had the most influence on the area has been the North Sea and its effect on moulding the history of the whole Sandlings area. So on this slide, I've put an extract from Hodkinson's map of 1783, so you can see where Easton Bavents is. It's sitting there between Southwold and Cove Hythe. And the photograph at the bottom, I went up to Southwold last week, and this is the view of Easton Bavents taken from the end of the pier car park looking north. And you can see a couple of the remaining houses in the village, and really the boundary goes from those houses to the coast, and you can see the coastline stretching away into the distance up to Cove Hythe. I've been interested in Easton Bavents all my life, really. I was born and brought up in Lowestoft, and Sunday afternoon walks as a child often included a visit to the ruined church at Cove Hythe, or we went to Southwold and started walking north from the beach. And as a child, it was interesting to look up at the cliffs and see parts of houses that were being taken down because the erosion had caused the cliffs to fall. And you'd see half-exposed pipes and things coming out of the cliff. And then about 30 years ago, I discovered something else. Like many people do, I started to investigate my family history, and I discovered that my paternal great-great-great-grandfather, William Lynes, had been living in a place called Easton Bavents, in a farmhouse near the cliff, according to the 1871 census, and I've put the census entry up here. In fact, there was only one house in the parish at that time. This is the only place. And this farmhouse was actually the last surviving of the old buildings from the parish of Easton Bavents, as Gardner describes it in his 1754 history. Just to the left, we can see his son George, who's shown here outside the Anchor Inn at Walberswick, where he was landlord, a publican and a pork butcher. And at his marriage, when he married in 1870, on his wedding certificate, it says that his place of residence was Easton Bavents. And then above that, I've put an image of the farmhouse that's on the edge of the cliff. This was published in Ernest Reed Cooper's book called The Suffolk Coast Garland in 1928. It's a very romanticised drawing, and it's drawn from an actual drawing of the house by Hamlet Watling, who I'm sure many of you will know for his wonderful drawings and paintings of Suffolk subjects. And he probably walked out to draw the farmhouse when he was the schoolmaster at Wangford in the 1840s. I've got a copy of the drawing by Hamlet Watling, a photograph of the drawing, which is at Southwold Museum, but as yet I've been unable to track down the original. So my interest in Eastern Bavents and the surrounding parts of the coastline has grown over the years and is now forming, as Margaret mentioned earlier, the basis of my PhD studies. I'll just tell you a little bit about the research. Bearing in mind that I'm only 1 year in, I've got lots of theories and suppositions and strands of questioning at this stage, but some of these require a lot more research before I can reveal my findings. The main ambition of my thesis is to examine a specific part of the dynamic Sandlings coastline, and I'm going to do it with reference to the now lost early modern community of Eastern Bavents. I shall be looking at the erosion over the period 1500 to 1750, and I'll be looking at it in relation to the families that were displaced by the erosion. I'm hoping that by analysing the social and economic impact of dramatic environmental change over a defined date range, that a deeper understanding of the community and its kinship ties will emerge. Many of the Sandlings coastal parishes were involved in the fishing and coastal maritime trade from early times, but studies of the smaller villages, which operated both a fishing and a coastal trade, and therefore formed an important part of the wider coastal network, are lacking for this early modern period. In 2001, Harold Fox laid in his study on the evolution of early fishing villages on the South Devon coast, laid down a sort of gauntlet to other historians when he asked the following questions about such communities. He said, were fishing villages really separate from agricultural communities? Were they and their people marginal and vulnerable? What of the supposed solidarity of fishing communities? And Fox, who sadly died in 2007, was one of the foremost landscape historians of rural communities, looking at the change that these communities wrought upon their landscapes. So my research will take the questions raised by Fox and examine them in relation to Eastern Bavents. In tracing the economic rise and demise of the parish, I'm hoping that an understanding of its dependence on the fishing and coastal trade and or agriculture will be understood. Also, in reconstituting the community, will the idea of it being marginal or vulnerable be challenged? Did the community look to its wider environs? It's known that people or men from the parish took part in fishing trips as far away as Iceland, and that links were forged with communities across the North Sea environment. The extent of the movement of people across the sea and their connectivity to other cultures and influences will be examined. I'm going to attempt to reconstitute the parish at certain points during the date range by using manorial records, taxation lists and probate material. Unfortunately, there are no surviving parish registers or other parish records. And to understand the erosion, I'm going to analyse historic maps and coastal portolan charts and rutters, which were the early navigational charts and the written instructions for navigating the coast. I'll just explain the two images I've put up here on the slide. The small coloured one on the left is an extract from a coastal chart of Suffolk, which was drawn up in 1539. It's an absolutely fantastic chart if you see the whole thing. It's held at the British Library. At that time, fortification of the coast was quite important to Henry VIII, as he feared an invasion from the combined forces of France and Spain. But you can see here Eastern Bavents being portrayed as a village up on a sandy cliff, and we can see Eastern Ness at the bottom. And the other image shows a village being inundated by a flood. It's actually a Dutch village. But I've just tried to portray somehow the sense of a community on a cliff being threatened with disaster. So let's move on to Thomas Gardner. I have to thank the late Dr. Blatchley for this information, because I've gleaned this from Thomas Gardner's biography on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which Dr. Blatchley wrote. Thomas Gardner was one of 4 sons, and he was baptised near Worcester in 1690. It seems he was brought up in Southwold by a childless uncle who was the brother of his father and this man's wife called Susan. He married first in London in 1713, and it was here that he trained and practised as an engraver. And here is a copy on the slide of his road map through Norfolk, which was published in 1719 from his volume called The Pocket Guide for the English Traveller. It It seems he had moved back to Southwold by 1726, where his wife died and is buried. A second marriage took place at Reydon to Mary Jordan, who was the widow of a previous bailiff of Southwold, and Gardner was connected with collecting duties of salt at Southwold. And it's during this time really that probably his interest in the declining town of Dunwich was sparked and led to the publication of his best known work. Here we have the title page for his work, and it's a very long title page, which is a nightmare when you're trying to reference things. It was published in 1754, his historical account of Dunwich, which was anciently a city, and it was printed for the author and sold by him in Southwold, and it was also sold in London by W. Owen at the Homer's Head near the Temple Bar. He dedicated his book to the commissioners of Southwold Harbour, who at this time were trying to revive the fortunes of the town by improving the harbour and its facilities. And other parishes covered in the book, or as Gardner tells us, towns that were nourished by the same common stream, which is the River Blythe. So the book covers Dunwich, Dingle, Blythburgh, Bullcamp, Walberswick, Southwold, Reydon, and finally Easton Bavents. Gardner gathered oral evidence from the oldest inhabitants of the area, which is invaluable now. And he also collected old coins, seals, and other material that he found on the beach and the foreshore. Dr. Blatchley tells us that Dr. Blatchley tells us that Gardner also, in 1745, exhibited at a meeting of the Society of Antiquaries his true and exact plat, which is another word for a map, of Dunwich, which was drawn by Ralph Agus in 1589. In his book, Joshua Kirby has used the map to draw an engraving of the town with a 1753 shoreline indicated on it. Sadly, the original 1589 map has been lost, so the Kirby engraving is the only record now. Gardner also found that many of Dunwich's original archives had been ransacked, but he was able to look at the collections of lots of other local antiquarians. The value of his work cannot be underestimated for its depth and commentary, and the fact that he ensured several references were given as to the source of his findings, which has allowed future generations the ability to backtrack and to try and clarify the material. His work has become a go-to volume for subsequent historians, and today it can be found referenced in many histories relating to the northeast Suffolk coast. So, what did Gardner say about Easton Bavents? Before I go any further, I'd just like to say that trying to find any images connected with Easton Bavents has been very difficult to source, obviously, because nothing physically survives. So I think I've had to be quite inventive in trying to find some illustrations for this talk. And also you do have the issue of copyright, which one has to be mindful of. So most of the photographs of local sites are my own, but I also have to thank the British Library, who did give me permission to use the images of the 1539 coastal survey that we saw a piece of before, and we'll see a bit more of it later. Right, so for Easton Bavents, there are 4 pages or 80 odd lines where Gardner detailed his findings, or on Easton Bavents, or East Town as he calls it. And this really was the first published material to provide an insight into the village. And also at the bottom you can see a prospect view of Southwold, and the couple of houses that are left of Easton are indicated at the letter P, which you might just be able to make out towards the left. Gardner divided his treatise, as he called it, into 3 books. Then he reduced it into chapters, and he divided it by sections, and finally subdivided it by verses. So Easton Bavents is chapter 10 in book 3. We have 2 sections subdivided into 16 verses. For those of you who have used Gardner's book on Dunwich, it is quite confusing with all its different chapters and verses and subdivisions. He tells us here that this town, situated on a high cliff, formerly was large and well peopled, but now is reduced to two dwelling houses with appurtenances and about 10 souls. He also describes Easton Bavents as reputed ancient and to have had considerable trade for the fishery, which it certainly did. And other aspects of my research have confirmed fishing trips to Iceland, and many will bequests include the leaving of boats and nets, and many of those to wives and daughters, and also bequests for the mending of the quay. And one of my research areas is to try and narrow down where the boats operated from. There probably was fishing from the beach, but there is also written evidence of a quay and or a haven in various sources. I'm now going to take us through some of Gardner's details and findings on the parish, and then move on to the Church of St Nicholas, the Chapel of St Margaret, and the Guild of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and discuss and expand upon them to provide a snapshot of Easton Bavents during the period 1500 to 1600. So Gardner tells us in his first page that Easton Bavents was the extensio of Ptolemy and the easternmost promontory in the kingdom, but that now Lowestoft is. And he references his information as from Camden's Britannia, a publication of 1610, and a copy of this is shown on the slide. And we can see here that Camden tells us that in 1610, Easton Ness shooteth out to the sea and is the most easterly place in all Britain. He also tells us that upon the point of this promontory standeth Easton, a village of fishermen well near eaten up by the sea. So even at this time, at 1610, the erosion was causing problems. And at the back of that, we have Saxton, a copy of Saxton's earlier map of Suffolk of 1575, which shows the promontory of Easton Ness. And it is interesting that the shape of the coastline of county maps did not really change over the next 200 years, as publishers of new maps generally just reused the old printing plates. Therefore, my research is going to concentrate mostly on looking at sea charts and the rutters, the written words, which were designed for navigation and hopefully will be more true to showing the coastline as it was viewed by the fishermen and the coasting vessels. So let's have a look at the Church of St Nicholas. On the left of the slide here, we have an image of some 14th century glass from a window at the church at Wrentham. This also is dedicated to St Nicholas, as Easton Bavents Church was, and Wrentham is just a couple of parishes away in northeast Suffolk. And the window is made up of the image of St Nicholas, who was the fishermen and sailors' patron, and fragments of other glass. And I wonder if the church at Easton Bavents had similar glass in the day. Thomas Gardner references that his information regarding the church was gleaned from wills held in the Beccles office. As of today, and as part of my ongoing research, I've transcribed just over 100 wills and administrations of inhabitants of Easton Bavents for the period 1490 to 1570. With further details of bequests and information coming to light. And I can confirm that the wills that are referenced by Gardner were wills that were all proven at the Suffolk Archdeaconry Court. And today these wills can be found housed in Suffolk archives. There's no record of a church given at Easton Bavents in Domesday, but it does appear in the later ecclesiastical taxations of 1254 and 1291. We have a late 12th century grant of land in Easton Bavents being given to the Priory of Blythburgh, and this describes land as being south of the roadway which stretches out west from the church in this town. So this confirms that the church was in existence by the late 1100s. And in 1306, we find the rector of Easton, who was called one Henry de Bavent. He was party to a bond for the parishioners who fish in the sea to pay a tithe of 5 shillings to a prior of Wangford. So we can get a sense of the economy at that time, that the parishioners were fishermen. Henry de Bavent, the rector, was one of the members of the de Bavent family, and Gardner tells us that the de Bavent family is from whom this town was so called. And the family actually came over from Normandy with William the Conqueror. And you can see on the slide here in the middle, the arms of the de Bavent family. This one is for Adam de Bavent. And it's taken from an heraldic roll held at the British Library called the Daring Roll. And this was drawn up somewhere between 1270 and 1280. And it lists those knights who owed feudal service to the king. and the arms can be described in heraldic language as argent, chief indented sable, and they're very simple arms, which actually indicates they're very early arms. Wangford Priory continued to receive payments from the church at Easton Bavents and also from its neighbours at Raydon, Southwold and Cove Hythe up to the Valor Ecclesiasticus in 1535, which was Henry VIII's survey of the value of the church at that date. At this point in the research, the physical location of the church within the parish cannot be determined, although I do have some thoughts. During the 15th century, other coastal parishes had moved the locations of their churches and they had rebuilt them. Walberswick's 15th century wealth was reflected in its parishioners moving from their old chapel down on the marsh and building their new ambitious church on top of a ridge, where it still stands today, although in ruins. Gardner tells us that the church at Easton Bavents was rebuilt 300 years ago, which would be around 1450, based on the testimonies of two unnamed wills, written, he said, in 1444 and 1454. Now, the only two Suffolk wills for those dates that I found are for one John Helm and one Edmund Cock. Gardner also says that a John Brooke had been buried in 1426 in the elder church, which indicates that he thought there was a younger church. But closer investigation of these points finds that John Brooke was actually buried in the church at Easton near Framlingham, as there is a brass there in place in the church in the 18th century. And Gardner's not alone in mistaking which Easton is being talked about. I'm coming across that quite a lot, in that Easton near Framlingham has been mixed up with Easton Bavents. And going back to the two wills that were mentioned, John Helm promised 100 shillings for the fabric of Easton Bavents Church in his will of 1444, but it was dependent on the return to this country of the ship he owned, in partnership with others from the King's service. If he did not return, then all his legacies were to be null and void. And Edmund Cock had promised 20 shillings for the fabric of the church in his will. But I think further examination of these 15th century wills is required to determine if there's a bit more tangible evidence to see that the church was rebuilt rather than just potential bequests left for the upkeep and embellishment of a church. A string of magnificent 15th century perpendicular churches had been built from the proceeds of fishing and trade at other parishes on the stretch of the coastline, at Lowestoft, at Kessingland, Cove Hythe, Southwold, Walberswick, and just inland, as this slide shows, at Blythburgh. And the community of Easton Bavents would most certainly have wished to celebrate the economic standing of their parish by the improvement of an existing structure or a rebuild. And the scale of these parish churches and their embellishments did not always seem to reflect the size of the communities they served. In the early years of the 16th century, the Church of Easton Bavents, dedicated to St Nicholas, was standing and was being used by its parishioners, and was certainly the focal point of the community, a community whose wealth was derived from the maritime economy. So a little bit more on the church. Gardner tells us in 1527 that money is left for making a font. I found a will of Robert Hawkins, Robert Hawkins writes his will in the February of 1527. He describes himself as Robert Hawkins the Elder, and he's also a mariner, and he leaves 6 shillings and 8pence for the making of a font. Now, the image you can see here is of the font at South Cove Church, which is the adjacent parish. And there's discussion that this font is not original to the church, and it appears to have damage on it, which is consistent with it being outside in the elements for a period of time. And there's conjecture that it may have come from St Nicholas's Church at Easton Bavents, or possibly one of the Dunwich churches. But there is another contender, because I found in the Lowestoft Town Book an entry in 1699 which says that a font given by Mr Jex of Lowestoft to the Chapel of Ease in the town also came from Easton Bavents. So a bit of a puzzle there. So let's have a look at the church during the period 1530 to 1580, which was a time of huge religious upheaval. Eamon Duffy, the historian, describes it as the stripping of the altars, and it's a very complex subject, and I'm only going to briefly touch upon it. But Duffy argues that many historians have erroneously used the evidence from wills to assess the impact of reform on the population of Tudor England. In its simplistic form, he says they've taken the changing patterns of testators' provision for masses and prayers to ease themselves through purgatory, changing to a provision for the upkeep of the poor as an indicator of shifting religious beliefs. Duffy, however, argues that there are more underlying external pressures at play. The practices around the belief in purgatory were being systematically dismantled by the Crown at this date, and funds left for such purposes and for the associated acts of charity were being diverted to the parish poor boxes. And if we look at the Easton Bavents wills for this period, we can see a confirmation of these changes in the direction of bequests. Robert Amos and Henry Lawson are both mariners, and in 1541 they are the last to make their bequests to the high altar, or in simple terms, a way of easing their way through purgatory. And John Botti, a husbandman, in 1548, 7 years later, is the first to leave a bequest stipulating money for the poor man's box of Easton rather than to the high altar, and the money in the parish poor box would have been divided out parish poor. And I think as the research develops, this argument will be explained further. I've just put in here an image of a poor box. I did struggle to find a picture of a poor box of Suffolk. Apparently there's a lovely one still remaining in the church at Parham, which is chained to the pews there. This one comes from a church in Norfolk. Another outcome of the change in religious beliefs and legislation can be found in the inventories of church goods, which were requested to be collected in 1547 by Edward VI, and the reason given for the collection of this information was to prevent embezzlement. But it was also apparent that many of the treasures were being sold off to prevent confiscation by the church authorities. For Easton Bavents in the November of that year, we can find that the church wardens, a Robert Starry and a John Cock, have sold, with the consent of the town, a cross, a pair of chalices, a pair of censers, which were the incense burners, and a pax or a pyx. I'm not quite sure there what the translation, they are different things. And they've sold all these goods for the sum of £29, 5 shillings and 4pence. And they state that they have used the money for the good of the town. And they've spent £13 on the safeguarding of the marshes to prevent further flooding, £11, 5 shillings and 5pence for the repair of the quay, and here we have a mention of the quay, and 26 shillings and 8pence was used to buy shot and to repair guns. And here on the slide I've put a little larger part of the coastal image from 1539. There is conjecture as to whether all these guns were put in place, but you can see gun positions at Southwold, between Southwold and Easton Bavents. There is one there at Easton, but it's quite faint now. Some at Cove Hive, and then also some at Kessingland. And I think further research into how the surrounding coastal parishes spent the monies raised from the sale of their church goods will be quite interesting to see whether they all wanted to safeguard or whether they were safeguarding and repairing the fabric of their parish, as Easton Bavents was. Obviously, protecting the marshes and repairing the quay was quite important to them at that time. What else does Gardner tell us about the church? He tells us a few more details about the bequests, including one that a Richard Strangeman in 1579 left money to build a clock house, and I've confirmed that with looking at his will transcription. Gardner then tells us that this church has long since been swallowed up by the sea. But when exactly was this? Can we use evidence from the wills left by the testators to try and find out when the church was last used by the villagers? Going back to the 100-odd wills and administrations I've looked at, I've tried to see if there are any clues. James Spooner was a wealthy merchant of Easton Bavents who had connections with the Icelandic fishing trade. And he had his will proved at the PCC, the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, in 1537, and there's an image of part of his will here. And he's the last parishioner to specifically request that his body be buried in the actual church of Easton Bavents. A John Rochester in 1552 asks to be buried in the church or the churchyard, but with no way of knowing what his family or executors opted for. Gardner states in his details that requests to be buried in the church continued to 1568 and concludes that this means the church is still standing at this date, but I found no evidence of such a bequest, although bequests for burials in the churchyard do continue to 1587, and those 1587 wills were written in the year that they were proven, so I think those testators would have had a reasonable expectation of being buried as requested. In 1616, Edward Benefice, a yeoman, makes no mention of where he wishes his body to lay, but his burial can be found recorded in the parish register at Southwold. And by 1625, Ambrose Jollop specifically asked to be buried in the churchyard at Reydon. So I think a reasoned judgment might be that the church was either no longer in existence by 1616, or the churchyard was in a precarious position. There is a Beatrice Pearce who dies in 1596 and is of Easton Bavents, according to her administration. Her burial is recorded at South Cove, but the rest of the family are also buried at South Cove, so I think she may have just opted to be buried with her family. During the late 16th and into the middle of the 17th century, the fine string of perpendicular churches in northeast Suffolk that I mentioned earlier started to fall into disrepair due to the combination of the change in the fortunes of the fishing industry, the loss of the population of the smaller parishes to support these huge structures, and changing religious practices. And you can see here on this slide an image of the ruin at Cove Hive, which we used to go to see as children, and also a model you can find in the church of the smaller church which was built into the ruins in 1670. There are records of an episcopal visitation within the Diocese of Norwich in 1602, and it lists those parishes with decayed churches and chancels. And the chancel was often in pre-Reformation times the responsibility of the rector to repair and maintain. Of the coastal parishes this visitation list lists, in the Deanery of Lothingland, Lowestoft, Pakefield and Kessingland are all listed in various ruinous states, whilst for the Deanery of Dunwich, none of the coastal churches are listed. And I'm not quite sure what this tells us about the Church of St Nicholas. If burials were no longer happening due to the threat of erosion of the churchyard, would the parish still have been maintaining the fabric of the church? That's quite a puzzle. Okay, let's move on to the chapel. Let's return to Gardner, yes, and his writings on Easton Bavents. He appears quite clear when he states this church, he's talking about the Church of St Nicholas, has been long since swallowed up by the sea, before he then proceeds to record what information he knows regarding the chapel. And his rationale for a chapel to still be in existence in 1638 is the granting of a marriage licence for this date. And it's this date of 1638 which has been repeatedly cited, potentially in error, as the last date at which the Church of St Nicholas was standing, which I don't think is correct. Now, chapels within the fishing villages at Southwold, Walberswick, Sizewell and Thorpe, all to the south of Easton Bavents, had grown up to serve the fishing communities, which were physically located nearer to the sea coast than the parish churches to which they were attached. So Southwold Church was a chapelry of Reydon, Walberswick was of Blythburgh, Sizewell of Leiston and Thorpe of Aldringham. And I was having quite a lot of difficulty in finding any sort of tangible evidence of the chapel of Easton Bavents, apart from a couple of mentions in wills, when I had a bit of a eureka moment, when I did find some tangible evidence, which was in a transcript of the calendar of papal registers for 1427, and I've put it here at the top of the slide. And this shows us that the townspeople of Easton Bavents went to the abbot of the Cistercian Abbey at Sibton for a licence to build a chapel in the said town and endow it with a priest without requiring a licence. And the reason for the request was that the said town was 1/4 of a mile from its parish church, so that the aged, pregnant women and others who are feeble cannot easily go to the said church for Mass and other divine offices, especially in winter, and are sometimes deprived of Mass. Which, as I say, was very much a eureka moment, definite evidence of the chapel. But this does raise the question of the location of both the church and the chapel, which requires further investigation. As a fishing community, was Easton Bavents following its neighbours in providing a chapel more convenient for a growing community nearer the seashore? On the South Devon coast, similar maritime settlements were building such chapels, although in the case of Exmouth, as Harold Fox tells us, the historian I mentioned before, a chapel nearer the sea was required to prevent inhabitants being cut off from the tide when they went to church. It also raises the question of why the inhabitants of Easton Bavents approached the abbot of Sibton for this mandate. It's possibly due to the influence within this part of Suffolk at this time of the abbey. And I've just put in an engraving here of the ruins of the abbey at Sibton. Gardner, however, recorded that parents of the people he talked to in 1754 remembered the chapel in a ruinous condition with one bell. If the chapel had been built seaward side of the church to offer worship nearer to the fishing community, then it is likely to have been lost years before the church through erosion. The chapel at Easton Bavents, dedicated to St Margaret's, was cited by Gardner as a place of pilgrimage on the evidence of an old, unnamed or unreferenced will. Now, Judith Middleton Stewart, who I'm sure some of you know her wonderful work Inward Purity, Outward Splendour, quotes 2 wills connected to this pilgrimage site, but the evidence for the Easton Bavents Chapel being a pilgrimage site is very scant at this stage of research. I have found, however, that in 1500 a John Childerhouse of Easton Bavents left a bequest for an image of St Barbara to stand in the wall in the church by St Margaret, which would seem to suggest that the Church of St Nicholas was home to a statue or an image of St Margaret prior to 1500, and this may potentially be the source of the pilgrimage tradition. And I've put here a picture of St Barbara with her tower, which is what she's shown with. Apparently her father imprisoned her in a tower and then cut off her head when she attempted to escape him. So, another puzzle. Let's move on from the chapel to the guild. Gardner simply states in his book on Easton Bavents that here was a guild of Our Lady, without providing any references for this statement. But if we go back to the wills I've been looking at, and also for the early one, thank you Peter Northeast, between 1456 and 1510, 6 Easton Bavents testators made reference to this guild, leaving money and stipends for the guild priest. The first bequest was in 1456, when Robert Briggs laid down the question and provided 10 marks if the parishioners of the said Easton wished to found a guild to ordain a priest, celebrating a same for the brethren and sisters. It's not known if this offer was acted upon, as further will bequests have not yet been transcribed prior to 1480. So I haven't done that intervening period yet. But in 1483, 1499, 1505, 1508 and 1510, further moneys are left, and the guild is varyingly described as the Guild of the Blessed Virgin, the Blessed Mary, Our Lady, and the Guild of St Mary. Understanding the purpose of guilds within communities at this date is complex, and I'm only going to touch on it here. The 3 main tenets, though, of a church base, a patron saint, and an annual mass or feast reoccur in the surviving records of specific guilds. There were definitely proven benefits to having a guild within a community. The binding of members in amicable relations, fulfilling social and religious needs, and providing communal activities have all been cited. This was probably a parish guild rather than a craft or a trade guild. So at present there is only minimal reference to the Easton Bavents Guild, but its dedication to the Blessed Virgin Mary demonstrates that the parish was following a popular cause. In 1389, nearly 16% of the 492 identified guilds at this date in Suffolk were dedicated to St Mary, although it's not known if her popularity was still as high by the turn of the 1500s. Understanding if the parish guild and the parish church were compatible institutions is a question which has been discussed by historians with conflicting ideas. But the bequest by William Boswell in 1499 is pertinent, I think, as he was described as lately rector of Easton, Bavents, and he provided 20 shillings for the sustentation of the Guild of the Blessed Virgin Mary of the same church, which would imply that the church and guild were harmonious institutions. Within the probate records, as presently studied, there is no mention of the guild after 1510, which leads one to question why the sudden decline in bequests after a 10-year period, although it's recognised that the popularity of parish guilds fluctuated. There was one further guild-related bequest, though, in 1513, when merchant Robert Rudnall of Easton Bavents bequested 6 shillings and 8pence to the Guild of Our Lady of Boston, and that's Boston in Lincolnshire, and it was an important trading port, and it is possible that Rudnall was a member of this guild, or he had trade connections with other guild members, and I've just put in an image here of the Boston Guildhall, which has survived to this day. So the religious guilds were dissolved and stripped of their property in 1547, after their holdings had been assessed by a commission, and the published returns from the Court of Augmentation for Suffolk do not record any guild or chantry in existence at Easton Bavents at this date, although there is evidence of such institutions at Cove Hythe and Southwold, its near neighbours. I have, however, come across a strange entry in the calendar of patent rolls for 1570. It says, the Guildhall in Easton Bavents, and it's listed as part of an extensive grant of former guild and chantry lands to a Hugh Council and a Robert Pister of Middlesex and London respectively, who, in recognitions of their services to Henry VIII, Edward VI and Elizabeth, were granted Suffolk guild holdings in Nayland, Ipswich, Layham, Rattleston, and it appears Easton Bavents, although that might be an error in the transcription. Something else to follow up. So, just a quick roundup to finish. Here's some more of the beautiful coastal chart for you to have a look at. But Gardner's writings on the church, chapel and guild at Easton Bavents provided the foundation for subsequent antiquarians, historians and general local history compilers to work with. Caution does need to be employed when referencing such findings to disentangle the fact from the romance of drowned villages and lost churches. I've tried to attempt to interrogate some of the original source material in this talk and to interpret the findings with reference to other contemporary material. Easton Bavents at the start of the 1500s was a community with a church, a chapel and guild, all the standard institutions required to satisfy the religious needs of its population. So that's me finished. I think there is time for a few questions.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for a very interesting, fascinating talk. I have got a couple of questions here.
Oh.
The first one is, you talk about will bequests for people of Easton Bavents leaving boats to relatives. Could you give us a little more detail about such bequests?
Oh, right. Okay. The boat bequests. Yeah. One of the strangest ones I've come across is, and that I think was also Henry Lawson. He left a bequest. He'd bought all the board, timber and the planks to build a carvel vessel, and he obviously hadn't built it when he became ill. And he bequests all of this to the town of Easton Bavents, to the townspeople, to build the boat. And he describes it as a double carvel, which I wouldn't profess to be a boat expert at this stage, but I think that is one of the larger trading vessels, which would have had two masts, two sails on it. I haven't come across that sort of bequest before. But yeah, there's carvel vessels being left. There's also another type of boat called a crayer. So all different fishing vessels, coastal vessels, and frustratingly, some of them just describe it as "I've just left my boat." They don't go tell you what kind of vessel it is. But as yet, I haven't found any huge descriptions of vessels. Obviously, the quay or the haven at Easton Bavents wasn't large. It couldn't take a large size boat.
Thank you. Can I just at this point, Keith Briggs has asked if he can make a comment. Can you please make it in writing and then I'll pass it on? Thank you. And the next question, you talk about fishing trips to Iceland, and you have found evidence of this. Can you expand on what you have found?
Yes, well, some of the wills were made, and the testators have actually said if I return from my trip to Iceland, or they're leaving things to relatives and mention Iceland. And just recently, I had some digital scans come back to me, which I think it's 1533. There's a record of the fleet that came back from Iceland. Of all the vessels, and it lists the harbours that they're moored up in, and they're all ports in Norfolk, Suffolk, and into London, just on this east coast of the country. And so we have the overall number of the vessels that came back, and these. I've seen reference to this list quite a lot, and it tells us that Dunwich had sent however many boats, and that Aldborough and Orford had sent boats. But when you look at it in detail, of the boats that are laid in Dunwich Haven, some of those are actually listed as of different places. So although they went into Dunwich, or were anchored at Dunwich Haven, they weren't of Dunwich. So we do have a vessel there from Easton Bavents. We also have some from Cove Hive, Walberswick and Southwold. And we get details of the masters and the merchants who financed the voyage. And there we have evidence of James Spooner, our merchant, is given as the merchant of the Easton Bavents boat.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
Right, I have a comment that has come from Keith. The Norman place name Bavent is said to mean beat wind, strangely appropriate for a place eroded away by the sea. Just a curiosity, more importantly, the Bavent family seemed to be one of many who claimed to come with the Conqueror, but actually came later. I don't think it's a question, it's a comment. Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you.
And at risk of sounding like a lawyer, no further questions at this
Good.
stage.
Thank you. Well, I hope I haven't sent anybody to sleep.